Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. We are taking a look here at a close-up view of the uterus. We're looking at a model, a photograph of a model, and we are looking at this sagittal cut. And when we look at the uterus, we'll see there are three layers of tissue. So the outermost layer is the perimetrium. This is going to be connective tissue. You'll see important ligaments are attached to this layer to help anchor this organ in the pelvic cavity. The next layer we have myometrium, and this is the smooth muscle tissue. This muscle will contract during labor and delivery to help push out that next generation. We'll see also that the myometrium will contract during the menses phase of the uterine cycle to help expel the old tissue. Some of us refer to that as cramping during our period or menstrual cycle. And then the innermost layer is called the endometrium. And the endometrium is going to be the layer we want to talk just a little bit more about. So the endometrium layer is the layer that will change with the uterine cycle. It's going to change with the uterine cycle. We'll see it's going to have a lot of glandular epithelium. And we'll see that it's going to be important in supporting the developing first embryo and then fetus. I don't actually have the timing memorized as to when do we call it a fetus. Let me look that up real fast. Okay, I've got it. So it's called a fetus at the 11th week of pregnancy. Kind of the standard I have in my mind is when you're no longer just a ball of cells and you're beginning to take on some appearance of that future adult self in some way. So the embryo is how we refer to this ball of developing cells prior to the 11th week of pregnancy. What I also wanted to talk about with the endometrium is that it does have a layer called the okay, so let's say the endometrium has two layers. And so we have the innermost layer, the stratum basale, which is not changing and it's not being lost. It would contain the stem cells. And then we have the layer called the stratum functionalis or functional layer, which is going to be the portion that changes. Now, what we'll see is extending up through the endometrial layer, you'll get these special arteries that kind of have a little spiral to them. And so we'll be seeing the changes that occur. So imagine like a little artery that's coiled, and the coil part is sticking up into that functional layer. And so what we'll see during the uterine cycle is these spiral arteries will constrict. And ultimately, if you are no longer nourishing your tissues don't have oxygen or nutrients, so those tissues die. And that's essentially what's going to be happening here. Spiral arteries. Okay, so as we talk about the uterine cycle, we are going to talk about it as having three stages. So we're going to get the first stage is referred to as the menses. And so what we actually see happening here is the decrease in progesterone that happens when the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans, and I'm going to graph this out for you, causes the spiral arteries to constrict, and they rupture some. So some of the blood that's lost is happening from that rupturing that's happening. And so essentially that stratum functionalis layer is going to die. And this is happening on average for about 5 days, but this does vary by individual, and it also varies by circumstance. So we see a lot of variation even in an individual's uterine cycle. So this can vary anywhere from about 2 to 7 days is what we're really expecting to see here. Next, we see what's called the proliferative phase. And this is happening when we get this increase of estrogen production that's happening from those follicle cells. And the Graafian follicle. And we get the endometrium to rebuild. And we should say specifically we're rebuilding the stratum functionalis. Obviously, we haven't lost the entire endometrial layer. And we'll see that this is happening about 14 days or so. This is going to stop at ovulation. So we'll see the third phase is the secretory phase. And this is happening from a trigger, from an increase in progesterone. And we get that increase in progesterone, remember, because we've ovulated, we've released the secondary oocyte, the Graafian follicle has become the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is releasing progesterone. And so we're basically preparing for implantation. We're going to get a fluid rich in glycogen. I think fluid is a little bit generous. It's more of a mucus rich in glycogen. This is going to nourish that embryo that's coming in from that fallopian tube and preparing to implant. Those spiral arteries are really developing to nourish all this tissue. And we'll see that this is lasting about 10 to 12 days. And so the uterine cycle should sort of correlate with the ovarian cycle. We'll see the ovarian cycle is more precisely timed at around 28 days, and we have a little bit of wiggle room here in the uterine cycle because of that menses stage having a lot of variation. So up next, we're going to take this information about the uterine cycle and we're going to lay it next to the information from the ovarian cycle and see how the two cycles have to coordinate together for maximum fertility. So stay tuned, and as always, take care of yourselves and each other.